Now we're going to turn to our fourth masterclass with Nick Craig, president of the Core Leadership Institute. He's going to help each of us begin the work we need to do to discover and define our own individual purpose. You should have received a worksheet from him in your pre-reading, but don't worry if you haven't gotten to it yet. You can pull it up at any time to continue this process. Again, we'll be taking audience questions at the end, so please put yours in the chat. Nick, I will send it over to you.
Thank you. So I want to thank the leaders who've gone before me today and how poignant they've been about talking about the topic I spend my life on, which is purpose. And one specific presentation, which was about Albert Bourla from Pfizer and the power that purpose played in helping them break all the rules to get us the COVID vaccine, because as of a couple of days ago, I received the Pfizer vaccine. So to know that it was purpose impacted is actually especially helpful for me. Now, what I want to do with you in the time I have is to take you into the world of purpose for yourself and begin to understand what purpose means for each of you. And as we look at this, what's interesting is that in some sense, the world of purpose has been one that we've seen a lot of. Oops, sorry. There's a lot of things that have been published about this topic. But in some sense, the opportunity today is for us to look at what are the questions that we need to ask ourselves? What are the questions we need to ask ourselves to really step into purpose more fully? In some sense, it's in the stories that we tell that we find purpose. Now, if I think about for my own life, when I say, well, when someone asks me, what do I do? That's the question only I get. I don't get anything about, no one asks me what my purpose is or what's my unique gift. And in some ways, if we think about it, for most of us, for most of our life, the only question we really get that has anything that might even be close to purpose is, so what do you want to be when you grow up? In some sense, this is the question we get most of our life. Now, the challenge with this is that this question has such limits to it as to what we can do and how we can answer it. And what's funny is that when I was a kid, when I went on this journey of dealing with adults who would ask me this silly question, the funny part for me is that I didn't have any clue what I should say. But I did decide I liked something on TV I really loved, and I decided I told everybody I wanted to be a starship captain. Now, I always got some very interesting responses from adults. And here's a picture of the closest I have come to being a starship captain. This is my Halloween costume, and usually I get away with wearing it a couple of other times in the year. Now, as you look at this costume, in some sense, it's a wonderful metaphor for the life that most of us lead. Most of us, on the journey of life, we get to wear the costume for about 4 or 5 years. CEOs have a life expectancy of about 4.5 years. And I spend a lot of time coaching people, helping them get to the place where they finally get to wear the costume, and then having them say, are you kidding me? Is this it? And then they spend the rest of their life talking about wanting to get back to what it was like when they were wearing it. I believe we have a bigger opportunity in our life. Rebecca Henderson, you did a beautiful job when you were talking about earlier today about death. And you said, the issue isn't the fact that we're going to die, because we're all going to. The real question is how are we living our life? And what does that look like? And in some sense, the challenge with the question, what do you do? And the answer to it is it so limits the possibility of who we are. In some sense, the real question is, who is it that sits underneath the costume, the title, the role? That's what we're really looking at. Well, purpose. Purpose is the unique gift that you bring to the world. And in some ways, it's what you bring that no one else brings. And my first question for you is as follows. What are the 1 or 2 things that only you can do? What are the 1 or 2 things that only you can do? Another way to think about this is, if you were to really show up, what would happen? Now, this particular question is one that I use with all senior executives that I work with, and we spend the first period of time having to answer this question. And what it really gets to is this. if I take any of you who are in this session today, and I say, I'm going to replace you with someone who has equal skills, equal capabilities, and has a similar background and experience as you, I'm going to put them in your challenging situation. Many of them are going to do the same things that you're going to do. Many of them will do the same thing. So if we take all of that off the table and we say that's keeping the seat warm, the question then becomes, is what is it you see? What is it that has deep meaning to you that no one else sees, that makes the difference? That if you don't do it, no one else will because they don't see it. In some sense, when Marvin was talking a couple of minutes ago about his childhood and growing up and what he saw in his house and what success looked like and what he didn't see outside, it was that same seeing something that others didn't see. So for each of us, this is a very powerful question that helps us step into that place that purpose resides. Now, another question, another way to play around with this is, well, actually, let me just say where this particular story came from or where I learned this insight was actually working with GE with their senior leadership program back in 2007 through 2010. And so I went through the Great Recession with GE and senior leaders playing around with this concept of purpose. Now, at the time, I wasn't sure that it was a powerful concept or that we should play around with it, but we did. In about 2010, one of the senior leaders who I had originally worked with came back. His name was Jim, and he's standing in front of the room. And this woman whose name was Susan was in the front row, and she asked him a very pointed question. She said, what is it we're going to learn here that's going to help us deal with things like what you just went through in the Great Recession? And he looked at her and he says, you know what, Susan, most of what you're going to learn here isn't going to help you. Because I'll tell you, when I had the darkest nights of my soul, the truth of the matter is that no raises, promotions, bonuses, or stock options were going to help anybody. And I had to keep my team together. And I realized the only thing I had was my purpose. Now, when he said this, I almost fell off my chair because it's the first time I began to see what the power of this was. He said, listen, my purpose is to be the whitewater raft guide that safely gets you to the other side. And when I was 21 years old, I was taking people down the rapids and I was their guide. And in 3 instances, I kept and pulled people out of the rapids and kept them from dying. And he said to his team, I will do the same for you, and I'm that committed to what we're doing. Now, in that moment, what he was doing is the one thing that he could do that nobody else saw, which was to speak from that place of purpose. His team stayed together, and they turned around the business. And this is when I began to see what the real power of purpose is. Purpose is the ultimate antidote to uncertainty because it is the one thing that does not change. It's the one thing that doesn't change. It's the essence of who you are. Now, another way to look at purpose, another question and a way to play around with this for each of you is to look at the question of what would be the magical moment from your childhood that really speaks to you? What's that magical moment in your childhood that really speaks to you? Now, for most of us, I didn't have a magical childhood, so I'm not talking about that. What I am talking about is a moment where the curious kid inside of you was truly present. For me, that always ends up being a powerful place where purpose resides, and especially in the times we're in right now, having that be the leader that we step into is really important. Now, in this particular case, I had a woman who was Palestinian by origin, growing up in the 70s and 80s. She was very poor. She had a challenging upbringing. She was not a refugee, but she was pretty close. And her only toy that she had was a kite that her father made from envelopes that they had received. That's how poor they were. And they moved to Bahrain, and apparently it was illegal to fly a kite. And she's crying. Now she's telling us the story. She's telling us the story. She starts to transform from somebody just sitting in this room to this deep level of presence and energy and curiosity. And she says, you know, what my father said, we were watching the space shuttle missions in NASA, far, world far away from ours. And he looked at me and he said, Christina, people get caught in the strings and the kites. Let's take this kite and let's build a rocket. The minute she said that, we all stepped back and we were like, oh, now we get who she is. Christina Habib, her purpose is to catalyze people who fly a kite to imagine the rocket. And her whole career made complete sense. She began to be able to communicate about who she was, what kind of a leader she was, what kind of challenges she needed, what kind of opportunities would help her bring her purpose fully alive. And it was that curious kid inside of her is the one that showed up. Now, for many of us, the place that we really find purpose is in the most challenging moments in our life. And in some ways, that's the place my purpose most shows up. And I think for many of us during the COVID adventure, we know that we've been deeply challenged. And so what I want to say to you is this is a place that purpose is most helpful, but also where it shows up. And in some sense, when we were talking with Albert about Pfizer, it's most when it showed up there as well. Well, I want to introduce you to a next question then. What's a very challenging life experience in which what you thought, said, or did made the difference? What you thought, said, or did made the difference. Let me give you an example. I'll introduce you to Stacy Tank. Stacy has a very cool purpose: to ignite the worthy fight and blow your hair back. Now that is an intense purpose. And when Stacy shows up, she's a very small person. Everybody turns around because there's an energy about her that is just so powerful and so present. Now, where does this come from? Well, this came from her telling us a series of her most challenging life stories. And she had more of them than most people I've ever met. And most of them would be ones that would have you be the victim of the story, but she was always the victor, which is what the Ignite the Worthy Fight is about. And blowing your hair back is that doing things way beyond what anybody else would ever expect under those circumstances, but it's at the core of who she is. And just one of her stories was in her 20s, her mother had ovarian cancer. And she's in her 20s realized that she had the same genes, the very high probability of having both ovarian and breast cancer. And she did elective surgery to address both of those. And she was the youngest woman to have those done in the health system that she was a part of in the United States. She's now a huge advocate of breast cancer research. Now, prior to the current role she's in, she was working for one of the top 2 retailers. She was head of communications. And she was in a job that normally burns people out in about 2 years because you have about 200,000 employees and a lot of things to deal with. And she was bored after 2 years. That's what this purpose will do for you. She went to the CEO and she said, listen, I need a real job. I want a P&L job. I want something big and challenging. And he looked at her like she was crazy and said, you're the comms person. I'm not. He said, I'm not stopping until you do. 2 years later, he finally says, okay, I'm going to give you the worst performing business we have. The previous 8 leaders in the last 3 years have all been fired. And here's the keys, Stacy, go fix it. She goes in and realizes it's much worse than he had said. She starts to do the thing that only she could do, which is to bring the truth out, because she is never afraid of the truth. And she has everybody start to tell the truth. And she has town meetings where the employees can say what they need to, ask what they need to, and all the questions have to be answered. And what happened as she did this is people would start to cry. And she started to say, well, why are you crying? And they all said basically the same thing, which is, this is the first time in our life we've ever really been listened to and heard and valued. Now, she did have a dark night of the soul. Many nights till 10 p.m. She's in her office. She said, okay, I think I may have overdone this. Maybe this is too big for me. I can't do this. But the plaque with this purpose statement was on the wall. And she remembers, and as she told me, I looked up and I read my purpose statement to myself. And I felt this sort of bolt of lightning, and I never looked back. She turned around this business and became the most profitable business within the company that she was working for at the time. So that's the power of purpose, and that's what it can really do for you in these challenging times. Now, I want to go to the current journey that we happen to be on with the COVID, but I want to talk about a gentleman named Tal Zaks. About 10 years ago, he was making a transition from being an emergency room physician to working for Big Pharma. And as we talked about and worked on his purpose, what we discovered his purpose to be was to translate science into medicine. To translate science into medicine. Now, for him, the word translate, and this is 10 years ago, was that the codex of biology is you have DNA, and DNA gets transcribed into messenger RNA, which then gets translated into proteins. Now, when he said this originally to me, I was like, okay, if you say so. And 5 years later, it's 2015, he calls me up and says, we have to have dinner. He says, I have to make the most important decision in my life. I feel really, really scared, but I feel enormously excited, way more excited than scared, but I just got to talk to you about this. He said, look, I'm in a great job, everything's great, but I've got this opportunity to go work for this very small company with about 200 people, and it turns out what they do for a living is my purpose statement. I says, what do you mean? They take messenger RNA and turn it into proteins. Well, he took the job as chief medical officer of Moderna. A little over a year ago, Tal calls me and says, I'm really, really excited and a little scared again now, so we need to talk. I says, what's up? He says, well, we're looking at the COVID thing, and we think with the messenger RNA, we could be one of the ones that provides a vaccine in the shortest period that's ever been done in human history. The challenge is we're only 800 people. And I have to make this decision, and I'm going to have to make this thing happen. And I said, well, I think you need to trust that when purpose shows up, you're going to always be really, really excited and a little scared. But we know how it's turned out. We know how it's turned out. He's currently working on the child vaccine, which is 6.5 months to 11 years. And I talked to him about a month ago, and he said, boy, talk about being really, really excited and a little scared. When heads of state call you, you definitely have a different way of thinking about what your role is. But in some ways, what's interesting about this is that what we have as a question for you, and my final question then is, and this is what I've seen with so many people who are in the place of purpose, and I would say everybody who's presented today can speak to this place, is what in your current adventures really excites you and is a little scary? That's a place that purpose resides. Now, in some ways, for me, what this really gets to is that place of, we all live in a place where mostly we have maps and we follow the maps and they give us the directions and we go where we need to go and we hope we get there. But when you're really excited and a little scared, the truth is that's because there is no map. This is the place that we end up leading. It's the place where we become the map makers. And I believe that everybody who's been speaking to you today is a map maker. And my invitation to all of you is, let's step into that place of purpose and all become map makers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. We joked when you and I were prepping for this that this conference is definitely what excites me and scares me, and I'm making my way through it. So thank you so much. I do want to take an audience question before we go.
Yep.
Nini asks, what if you feel as if your purpose resides outside of your work? How do you translate that sense of purpose to the workplace, even if it's not your life priority?
Yeah, so here's what we've discovered is that if you dig deeper into the purpose you have and articulate it, to be a really powerful purpose, it needs to be independent of your context. In some ways, a real purpose is one that you can apply in every context in your life. The strategy of how you express that purpose will be different. The strategy is different. But my sense is for you is to really look underneath to what's at the core of that purpose. And underneath that, you'll find something that you can apply in all your different contexts.
Okay, one final question. This is from an anonymous audience member. What's your purpose, Nick?
My purpose is to wake you up, to really wake you up and have you really be home. And I hope that that's what I've done with all of you today.
Yes, and as a reminder, everyone can go to that worksheet and follow along, continue this journey. Nick, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.